Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ready Steady Play, where I'm here with Icaion. Icaion? The new game from Tabula Games. Icaion is for 2 to 4 players. It takes roughly 90 minutes to 2 hours. The game is an action selection game in which you are wandering around a world rich with resources, trying to grab those resources for yourself and explore the mysteries of the Colossus. But the Colossus is not entirely friendly, as it sheds parasites all over the land. You'll have to clear those up too. You'll collect victory points from defeating parasites, investigating the Colossus, and visiting the city to capture technologies. At the end of the game, you'll get points for all of these things, and if you've got the most points, you will be the master explorer of the lands of Icaion. This is a Kickstarter prototype, so with that in mind, I'm going to set up a game for 3 players. Here we've got the Icaion board, and what's important to note about the board is that there are these 5 craters around the outside. It's divided up into regions, which are external if they're touching the outside of the board, and internal if they're touching this city in the middle. There's a victory point tracker around the outside. Now, the thing that's kind of cool about this is you can actually play this action selection game I'm about to teach you, or you can combine this with Mystia to create a tower defense, a fully cooperative tower defense game. So this creates an entirely new game with Mystia, and if you're interested in that, maybe I'll make some videos about it. But in the meantime, it's important to note there are 5 regions on the board. You've got the forest, the crystals, the rivers, the mists, and the mountains. It's also worth noting that the craters are actually divided into 5 colors as well. Green, grey, blue, orange, and red. I've also got here an events board. The events board has a 2 to 3 player side and a 4 player side. And we've got, that's because of this track here, which is going to track event cards as they come out. Over here you can see we've got 3 spaces, but only the Curio space is used in Icaion. These other 2 spaces are used for the combo game with Mystia. I've got some iconography down here, which I can explain in more detail later on. I'm going to put it out on the 2 to 3 player side because I'm going to set up a 3 player game. Now here I've got 5 different kinds of Qoam crystals. We've got blue ones, pink ones, brown ones, grey ones, and green ones. We've also got Parasites. And I'm sure all of these tokens will look cooler in the final product, but this is what we've got for the prototype. Qoam is what we're going to be collecting as we wander around the world of Icaion, harvesting it for its natural resources. These parasites are going to be given off by the Colossus. They're not going to kill us, but they're going to blow up our machines and things, so we kind of need to clear them out. A bit like that scene in The Fifth Element. Remember when he's blasting the spaceship? Anyway, if you let too many parasites build up in an area, all of your cool stuff's going to blow up. More on that later. But for setup, we're going to set it up differently depending on whether there's 2 or 3 or 4 players. In a 2 to 3 player game, you're going to put out 1 Qoam in each of the external regions that matches its type, and 2 Qoam in each of the central regions that touch the city, again matching its type. In a 4-player game, it's going to be 2 Qoam in all regions matching type, but then the 5 central regions are also going to have 1 parasite in them. So let's do that for 2 to 3 players now. Awesome! If you're playing with 4 players, you would have 2 Qoam in every region, and parasites in the central region. Now that we've set that up, what we're going to do is we're going to randomly put out the Colossus. Rah! Look at this guy. The Colossus is going to randomly move around the map, causing some disturbance to the regions he's adjacent to. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the Colossus in a randomly chosen crater, and you can choose this crater randomly however you want. Maybe we shake up some of these guys and drop one. Bam! We got gray. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to put out a parasite in each region adjacent to where the Colossus was placed. You may have spotted these holes in the base of the Colossus. These are for primal shards. These are primal shards, and they're some kind of ancient artifact that we're, after for some reason. I guess they're, superpower magical, ancient magic. Anyway, they have these numbers 1 through 3 on them. Later on, we're going to put primal shards into the base of the Colossus. But for now, just shuffle them and set them to one side. If you have a draw bag or something, that's ideal for this. Here we've got some attachments in 5 different colors, and we're going to put these into stacks in the city. The orientation around the city, it doesn't matter. All that matters is that the numbers 1, 2, and 3 are in ascending order. There we go. So now that we're done setting up the city board, let's take a look at the events board. So we've got a deck of Curio cards. We can just dump that down here. We've got 3 Colossus cards. Give those a shuffle so that they're in a random order, and then put them out in these 3 spaces here, face up. Now we've got these 5 land type cards here. Each one corresponds to a land type on the board. So give those a shuffle, and then put them down in this space here. Cool, and that's the event board. Nice and simple. Now let's do some of these player boards. So I'm going to take these 4 attunement stones and discard any that won't be used because I don't have enough players. Bye-bye, number 4. Then I'll give each player 1 attunement stone, and they're going to slot that onto their board. Then we're going to give these upgrade cards a shuffle, and each player is going to get one at random, which they'll put into the side of their player board here. There we go. Each player is also going to get a random hero. Cool, we're the heir. And he goes down here. Here's a bag full of player pieces. Unfortunately, we don't have any miniatures in this prototype version, so the heir will look like this. This is a victory point marker. Now these are called harvesters. In the actual game, they're going to be cool miniatures. In this, they're little wooden trains. And they're going to go down here on this column of your player board. Next, we're going to put out scavengers, which look like these cool wooden bridges. And they fill up the next column. And as you guessed it, finally we've got these refiners, which are going to go in the final column of your player board. Now, there are symbols and things underneath each of these buildings. As you place these buildings out, you're going to unlock new abilities. But we'll look at that when we get to the action, deploying buildings on the board. These cards here give you special asymmetrical powers. This here is a special ability based on your Seeker. This is a special ability based on your equipment. These white cards here are the number of Curio cards, which are these ones, that you can hold in your hand at any given time. The ones with the circles on are the number of upgrades you can have at any given time. Some Curio cards like this one have the upgrade symbol on, which means they can be installed on your player board as an ongoing upgrade. So this character here can have 5 at a time. Finally, these 2 symbols here are your starting Qoam. In this case, we start with a green and a blue Qoam, and we have to put these into one of our null cages. These are null cages here, and I'll explain them in more detail when we get to extracting Qoam from the board. Note that you'll put all of the Qoam you get from your starting cards into one null cage, no matter how many there are or what colors they are. I've got here the blue and yellow player boards, but I'm not going to set them up. For demonstrative purposes, I'm just going to use their victory point token and meeple on the board here. In a 4-player game, each player sets up their board like this. In a 3-player game, what you'll do is you'll put out some extra buildings from the 4th unused color, and in a 2-player game, you'll put out even more extra buildings. And this is to inform the game later on. So what we're going to do now is put out the buildings for the 3-player game. We've got the green buildings here. And in a 2-player game, each player would take turns in player order, placing all 9 of these buildings onto the board. In a 3-player game, we're going to place 6 of the buildings. And you can choose any of the 6 buildings to put out. But you must make sure that there are 2 of each kind in the end, and that they are all in a different region. So I'm just going to distribute them randomly for now. Each player puts their victory point tracker here into the 0 spot on the victory point track. So now that we've done that, we're ready to put our people on the board. And when you deploy your people on the board, you go in reverse turn order, and you pick one of the nodes on the outside of the board to do it. These nodes are the ones that touch the board edge, but not a crater. So here you can see a node, which is this little white spot on the board along the gray borders of the spaces. It's touching this crater, so we can't deploy there. This one is on the outside of the board, and so we can deploy there. And we'll say our 3rd player is blue, who'll go down here. Yellow will go next as player number 2, and then finally red. So the last thing we're going to do is deal 3 random Curio cards to each player as their starting hand. And once we've done that, the game's set up and we're ready to play. So, the game takes place over the course of 3 years. Each year is divided into a number of turns that will involve Qoam appearing on the board and us moving around the board to collect it and try to earn victory points. Or I think in this game they're called glory points. So the years basically take place in 3 phases. The first phase is the sort of setup for the year. In the setup for the year, we're going to add a Colossus card to this deck and then shuffle it. In expert level mode, what we're going to do is turn the top card face up. And whenever you take a card off this deck, you will turn the next one face up as well. So it's always face up. Then what we're going to do is make sure that there are enough primal stones here in the Colossus's base. The turn order will change, and then what we're going to do is start the second phase, which is the player phase. In the player phase, players will take turns moving around the board and doing things, and then at the final phase, we'll score points for the parasites we've killed, and then it'll be back to the top of the year. The only time this changes is at the end of the third year, when the game is over. After the final phase of the third year, instead of going back to the start, we'll do endgame scoring and determine a winner. So at the end of the game, you'll be awarded points based on the number of primal shards you've collected from the Colossus. You'll get points for every Qoam you've got in your null cages. You'll gain points for every apparatus that you've installed on your player board. You can also link your primal shards to the apparatus to double those points. There are a number of ways to gain points during the course of the game as well. And the player with the most points in the end is, of course, the winner. And in the case of a tie, the player who was last in turn order of the final round is the winner. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pick up this deck of cards, and we're going to take this Year 1 Colossus card and shuffle it into the deck. As you can see, they all have the same back precisely for this purpose. And once we've shuffled it, we're going to turn the top card face up, and in this case we've got the mountains. Remember these primal shards? Well, what we're going to do now is pick 3 at random to slot into the base of the Colossus. If we had 4 players, we'd use 4. Wow, what mysteries do they hold? We'll find out later. And so when a round of player turns begins, we take the first card of the event deck and we move it over to the first slot on the track. Now, there are 2 different ways of resolving this based on whether it is a land card like this or one of the Colossus cards. So we'll look at the Colossus cards in a minute, but first let's look at what happens when you put this mountain card out. There are 2 things to note when resolving a land card in this space. These 2 symbols here. As you can see, we've got 2 in the square here. This is 2 Qoam. This little diamond always represents Qoam stuff. And here we've got the Parasite symbol as well. In the next space, we still have the Qoam, but no Parasite. Later on, the amount of Chrome increases as well. We've also got this refresh the emergency power supply thing here, but we'll talk about that later on. So by putting out the mountain card here, we're going to take 2 Qoam that match this mountain's color and put them into each region for the mountains. This means we'll also put a Parasite into each mountain region. However, in a 2 to 3 player game, you do not put a Parasite in the internal regions. So here I've got my 2 Qoam and a Parasite, and they go down into this region. Because there's only 3 players, we don't put a Parasite in here, because it's the internal region touching the city. In a 3-player game, the maximum amount of Qoam per region is 6. If you would ever put out more than 6 Qoam, just don't put out the rest. Additionally, if you would ever put out a 4th Parasite in a region, do not. The 4th Parasite means there's been a parasite infestation, they've overwhelmed the region, and they've consumed all the resources. In this case, remove all of the parasites, all of the Qoam, and all of the machines. Put the parasites and the Qoam back into the supplies, put the machines back into the game box. They're out of the game. More on machines later on. For now, let's look at deploying a Colossus card. So I'm going to show you this Colossus card here because it's got all of the iconography along the bottom. So this iconography here means put 2 parasites in each region adjacent to the Colossus. This one here means move the Colossus, and this one here means do a wound to each seeker on a node adjacent to the crater the Colossus is in. This symbol here is a particularly deadly symbol. This means the Colossus does wounds as it moves. I'll explain wounds to seekers later. When you put out parasites in each adjacent region to the Colossus, you take 2 parasites and put them down on the game board like this. When the Colossus moves, it moves a number of spaces indicated by the space occupied by the card on the event board. For example, if our Colossus card comes out here, the Colossus will move 1 space to the next crater. And if it comes out here, it will move 2 spaces. The Colossus always moves in a clockwise direction, so if it moves 1 crater, it will move to here. And if it moves 2 craters, it will move to here. When the Colossus attacks, it will do a damage to each seeker on a node on a region adjacent to the crater, not just nodes adjacent to the crater. So what this means is that if the Colossus were to end up here and do an attack, he would wound the blue meeple because this region here, this water region, is adjacent to the crater. Sometimes the Colossus will only attack once he stops, and sometimes he will wound Seekers on each crater that he moves through, not including the starting crater. When you're playing on expert level, the Colossus card will always be face up on this deck before it comes out, so you'll have some warning about what's going to happen to give you a chance to get out of there if you can. After the event card has been resolved on the event board, players will take turns having a turn. You'll start with the player who has the emergency supply with the 1 on it, and go through in player order until each player has had a turn. Then you'll go back to the event deck doing another event card. You'll continue this process until all 5 regions are out on the event board. After the 5th region comes out, everyone will have one last turn, and then we'll move into the end phase. This is what the event board might look like at the end of year 1. So a player's turn will consist of basically 3 different elements. The first element is move or camp. Moving means moving between the nodes on the board, these little white spots on the borders between regions. Camping means not moving. More on that in a minute. The second thing you can do is a standard action. You must do a standard action. The third thing you can do is a special action, which you can do before or after your standard action. There are 7 types of standard action in the game and 2 kinds of special action. Note that you can only do these after you have elected to move or camp. The standard actions you can do are extract Qoam, deploy a machine, eradicate parasites, investigate the Colossus, retrieve an apparatus, install an apparatus, or keep watch. The special actions you can do are activate your emergency power supply or play a Curio card. So now what we're going to do is go through these in order. But I'll just cover keep a watch now. It is nothing. If you keep watch as a standard action, then you just don't do a standard action, but it still counts as doing one, if that's important. So the first thing we're going to briefly cover is move and camp. You will always begin your turn on nodes, and when you must move 1 or 2 nodes, and you cannot end in the same node you began in, which means none of this, 1, 2. You can go 1 node like this, or 2 nodes like that. This movement is indicated by this symbol here in the row on your board. This icon here indicates that you must move 1 or 2. This down here says that what you can do is you can spend a blue Qoam in order to not move at all, in case you want to stay still. As you build the buildings from this row on your board, you can improve this ability. This says that for a blue Qoam, you can now move up to 3 spaces. And this one says that when you spend the blue Qoam, you can now move up to 4. This last spot gives you a one-off bonus, which we'll look at later. You are always adjacent to any of the regions next to the node that you're on. So that's move and camp. It'll become more apparent to you as you see how the game works, why you might want to camp. So for me, the most important action is building buildings, deploying the machines. So let's talk about that first. When you deploy a machine, you must take it from the leftmost column on your board. So that means that you're unlocking abilities as you put out the machines. This also means the very first machine you deploy must be a harvester. When you deploy a building, you must pick a region adjacent to your seeker. And then you must pay Qoam equal to the number of machines in that region that also matches the region's color. So in this case, 1 brown Qoam. Now there are 2 restrictions to note about placing a machine. The first is that it must be unique in color. That means that you cannot have 2 machines in the same region. The second is that it must be unique in type, and this includes your opponent's machines. So you cannot have 2 machines of the same type in the same region. When you do put out a machine, you gain reputation points. You will gain a number equal to the cost of placing the machine in Qoam multiplied by the number of machines adjacent to that region that match its type. In this case, we can see that there is only 1 other harvester adjacent to this region, and you count all harvesters including your opponents. So we'll get 1 Qoam times 1 harvester, which is 1 reputation point. So all of these machines have a special application, but that doesn't come into effect until you take an extract action, which we'll talk about next. The one thing that is important to note is that every piece of Qoam has its own unique application. And I'll talk about those applications as they come up. For example, the blue Qoam we already looked at allows you to move. In this case, you can use brown Qoam as wild to place a machine in a region. So if, for example, you wanted to put down your scavenger here, down here into this crystal region, but they didn't have 2 pink Qoam, they could use the brown Qoam in lieu of it. They could pay 1 or 2 brown Qoam, in addition to pink Qoam. So I've revealed here, guys, what you can see on the entire revealed player board. Remember that this row here is your harvesters, this row here is your scavengers, and this row here is your refiners. Now, unlocking this column here and this column here will improve the actions in the leftmost space. But unlocking this column here will give you one-off bonuses. This first one will allow you to immediately refresh your emergency power supply. We'll talk about that a bit more later on when we get to special actions. And it will also immediately give you 5 reputation points. All of these refresh your emergency power supply, so keep that in mind. This one will give you 2 Qoam of any kind, and this one will give you 2 Curio cards. All of these are resolved immediately, and then do not have any further effect over the course of the game. That's the deploy machine standard action. The next standard action we'll look at is extract. Let's go back to our red player. Now, if the red player is here and he wants to perform an extract action, he'll gain 1 Qoam from each region to which he is adjacent. He'll gain an additional brown Qoam because he has a harvester in the mountain region. When you extract Qoam, you must put it in a null cage, just like you did at the start of the game. All of it must go into the same null cage all at once, no matter how much of it there is or what color it is. You can choose to empty a null cage that you've already got on your board in order to place your new Qoam into that cage. However, you will lose any of the Qoam that was in the cage. When you're spending Qoam from the null cages, either the blue ones for movement or the brown ones for placing a machine, you can take the Qoam from any relevant cage. You're not bound to any cage. You can spend them. You can spend Qoam from any null cage in any order. Putting out the buildings in the bottom row unlocks additional null cages. If you have a scavenger on the board, when you extract, you also gain 1 Curio card from the Curio deck. If you have a refiner on the board when you extract, you will also gain an additional 2 reputation points when you extract. Note that when you extract, you only gain the resources for regions adjacent to the seeker, and you will only activate the buildings in the regions that you take resources from. Now let's talk about Eradicate Parasites. If you're on a node adjacent to regions containing parasites, you can eradicate these parasites. When you eradicate parasites, you must spend gray Qoam. And for each gray Qoam, you can eradicate a number of parasites equal to the strength of your seeker on your player board. The top row of our player board here indicates the strength of our seeker. We all start with 1 strength here, but as you build these buildings, your strength increases. So at the beginning of the game, when we spend 1 gray Qoam, we get to kill 1 parasite. Later on, when we've unlocked these 2 spaces here, 1 gray Qoam will kill up to 3 parasites. You can spend any amount of gray Qoam so long as you have it available in your null cages when you do this. You can eradicate parasites from any region adjacent to your node and choose freely, and when you do eradicate a parasite, keep it on your player board because you'll score points for these at the end of the year. Any Qoam you spent will go back to the supply. The fourth kind of standard action you can do is investigate the Colossus. If you are on a node adjacent to the Colossus's crater, then you can carry out an investigate action. When you choose to investigate the Colossus, you pull one of the primal shards from his base and check the number on it. You can then spend any number of pink Qoams from your player board, and for each pink Qoam you spend, you will gain 1 reputation point. Note that you can spend as many as you like, which may be more than the number shown on the primal shard. For each pink Qoam spent in this way, you will advance 1 space on the reputation track. If the number you spent exceeds the value on the primal shard, then you keep it and put it on your player board. Note that you can only have a maximum of 5 primal shards. You can only investigate the primal shard when you are on a node adjacent to the crater containing the Colossus. And remember that the primal shards are only refreshed at the beginning of the year. Primal shards on your player board are used for endgame scoring, so we'll look at those later on. The next thing you can do is retrieve an apparatus. This is really very simple. If you are on a node adjacent to the city, then you can pick one of these 5 apparatuses to take and put onto your player board. Now there are a few things to note about this. You cannot take an apparatus of a color that you already have. Each apparatus gives you points immediately when you take it based on what color it is. The orange one here will give you 3 reputation points for each harvester that you've deployed on the board. When you've chosen an apparatus, you put it here into this slot on your player board. You cannot retrieve another apparatus while this space is full. When you take the apparatus, you immediately score the pertinent amount of reputation points. And that's all there is to retrieve an apparatus. But there's also install an apparatus, wherein you must find the crater that matches the color of the apparatus. In this case, we've taken the orange apparatus, so we must journey to the orange crater if we want to install it. It doesn't matter whether the Colossus is there or not. Our red seeker journeys around the board to the orange crater here. Now that they're here, as a standard action, they can do install an apparatus. They'll take the apparatus and install it into the appropriate slot on their player board. This is a year 1 apparatus, so it will go down here. The reason for doing this is because you will score this apparatus again during endgame scoring, and it can be a big benefit to you. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail later on. Note that you can only install 1 apparatus per year, and you can only install an apparatus into an open slot, which means that if you head back to the city and take another year 1 apparatus, then you can never install it, so don't do that. The second thing is that you can only ever take an apparatus that doesn't match in color to one you've already got installed. So this is the only orange apparatus you'll be able to take during the course of this game. So those are the 2 apparatus actions. The final action we already covered, keep a watch, means do nothing. So we're on to the special action. There are 2 kinds of special actions, play a Curio card and the emergency supply. First, let's look at play a Curio card. So there are many ways to pick up a Curio card in the game. We looked at how you can get them for the scavenger, for example. And Curio cards come in 2 different types. You've got these ones here, which are instants, and can be played for an immediate benefit. And you've got cards like this, which have this little arrow symbol here, which means that they are upgrades. This one gives you an additional null cage, and this one gives you an additional sword when eradicating parasites. Any that you do install just go up on your player board like this, and are just kept there to remind you. Remember, you can only have a number of upgrades equal to these values on your player board, and so if you would get, for example in this case, a 6th upgrade card, you must discard one. Remember, you also have a hand size of Curio cards equal to these values here. When you play a Curio card, you must pay the cost in green Qoam, which is indicated on the top of the card. This is the use of green Qoam in the game. When you play an instant card, you immediately get the benefit on the card. For example, this one will give you 5 reputation points. If you play an instant Curio card, you just put it into the discard pile. If you would ever draw a Curio card that would take you over your hand size, don't draw a card at all. So that's Curio cards. Let's talk about the emergency power supply, which is this guy here. Now, as a special action here, you can exhaust the emergency power supply, flipping it over to its expended side. When you do this, you can do one of 3 things. You can draw 2 Curio cards. Keep in mind your hand size. You can overcharge your machines, and you can work double shift. Working double shift is very straightforward. That means that you basically move and standard action again. So you must resolve the move first, which means either moving up to 2 spaces or spending a blue Qoam to not move at all, and then you can do another standard action. You cannot take another special action this round, though. So it essentially substitutes your special action for another standard, and move. Overcharge machinery is a bit different. When you overcharge machinery, you gain 1 Qoam from the supply of any color. Then you'll gain 1 Qoam from each region where you have a machine. Note that this Qoam is taken from the supply, so even if the region is empty, you'll still gain 1 of that color. The 3 overcharge actions are indicated here on the event board. Overcharge machines, take 2 Curio cards, work double shift. Now that we've finished talking about how player turns work, let's talk quickly about what happens when a Seeker is wounded. If the Colossus happens to show up in your crater and your Seeker is wounded, you have 2 choices. Either discard a Curio card, in which case nothing further happens, or lie your Seeker down. This indicates that they're wounded. On your next turn, you stand up and carry out your move as normal, which means move 2 nodes, or camp. You cannot move more than 2 nodes if this is the case, and you cannot move again this round no matter what you do. So that's important to know. You can only move a maximum of 2 nodes if you stood up from wounded. Furthermore, you cannot have a special action. This turn, you forgo your special action and you only get 1 standard action. Once every player has had the opportunity to take a turn, we'll flip over the next card from the event deck, unless all 5 regions are out, in which case the round will end. At this point, we'll award points for parasites killed. The player who killed the most parasites will get a number of points based on the number of players. The second place player will also gain points, again based on the number. The third place player will also gain points. But any player who didn't kill any parasites doesn't get any points at all. In a 2 and 3 player game, it's 9 points for first place, 4 points for second place, and a point for third place. In a 4 player game, it's 10 points for first place, 6 points for second place, and 2 points for third place. If you didn't kill any, you don't get any points. Then your parasites go back to the supply. So once you've scored for the parasites, then all you do is discard the top card from each Apparatus deck. And this is because we're no longer in the first year, but we're moving into the second or third year. So we're just going to get rid of any cards that show the previous year so that the current year is depicted here. Note that all the cards in each pile do the same thing. And then you go back to the beginning of the year. At the beginning of the year, you collect up all the event cards. You take the next year's Colossus, shuffle that into the event deck, and as we talked about before, flip up the top card so it's face up, but that's only in expert mode. If you don't want to play with that, you can keep it face down. We place more primal shards into the creature's base as necessary, and then finally we're going to adjust the player order. The player with the most reputation points will become the last player in turn order. So the player at the back will become the first player. Now in this case, yellow and blue are tied for last place. If that's the case, then whoever was last player last round will win the tie and move up this round. And once the turn order has been adjusted, all of the emergency power supplies are refreshed, and then we're ready to begin a new year. If this was the end of the third year, instead of doing this, we'd go on to endgame scoring, so let's talk about that in a little bit more detail now. Here we've got what might resemble an endgame player board. At the end of the game, you will score 1 point for every Qoam here in your null cages. In this case, we've got 8, so we're going to score 8 points. Additionally, we're going to score all of these installed apparatus again. Remember, you might not have 1 apparatus in each slot. If you have an apparatus in your slot here, it doesn't matter. This is not scored. Only installed apparatus are scored in endgame. So once again, we are now going to get 3 points for every harvester we have. We're going to get 5 for every primal shard we have. We're also going to get 3 for each unlocked space on the top row here, the parasite eradication row. So in this case, 9 points. But before you score these, you might want to take a look at your primal shards. You're going to get points based on the number of primal shards you have here. If you have 0, you get negative 15 points, which is a big deal. Remember that. If you have 3, you get 10. And if you have all 5, you get 30, which is awesome. You can also attach your primal shards to the apparatus to double their value. This does not remove them from the set collection. This is in addition to it. Now, in this case, we might as well double the score on all of the installed apparatuses. We're very lucky to have enough primal shards and apparatus to do this. Each one can only be doubled once, so we cannot put 2 primal shards into the same one. And the primal shards still count towards the set bonus. The points visible here are not scored again. This is a one-time bonus when the building is built. So those are all the standard ways to score the end game. Once everybody's totaled up their points, then whoever has the most is the winner, and the tie is broken by whoever is last in turn order. And that's how you play Icaion. I hope you've enjoyed this rules explanation and that it's given you some insight into how the game works. But if you want to come back tomorrow, I'll be sitting down with Michael and Ollie to play Icaion. And also, if you'd like to see how it integrates with Mystia to create an entirely different cooperative game called The Fall, leave a comment down below, and I'll think about doing some videos for that too. In the meantime, this is live on Kickstarter when I published this video, so if you're watching it within that time frame, go check out Icaion on Kickstarter and see if this is something that you're interested in getting involved with. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you tomorrow. Icaion.